During the final days on Okinawa in April 1945, Kenji Tanaka's world revolved around his shattered leg. An American artillery shell had struck his position at dawn, leaving bone fragments protruding from his torn flesh. His squad leader handed him 2 grenades, a clear, unspoken order in line with Japanese military doctrine. Capture meant dishonor, death was preferable. However, Marines overran their position before Kenji could pull the pins. American corpsmen immediately began dragging wounded soldiers toward aid stations. Expecting execution, Kenji lost consciousness. 3 days later, he awoke on the USS Consolation, a hospital ship steaming away from Okinawa's smoking hills. The ship's clean sheets were baffling. Japanese propaganda had conditioned him to expect torture, medical experiments akin to those rumored in Unit 731, and savage treatment as an enemy of the Emperor. Instead, Navy doctors meticulously operated on his leg while plasma infused his arm. He observed American medics treating Japanese wounded with the same urgency as their own casualties, a reality that defied his understanding of warfare. The journey to Camp McCoy spanned 8 weeks. Kenji and 47 other wounded Japanese prisoners traveled by train across the Pacific to California, then eastward through landscapes that contradicted all he'd been taught about America's dwindling resources due to total war. Through the railcar windows, he witnessed vast farmlands worked by machinery, not starving laborers. Cities stood intact, untouched by bombing. At night, lights blazed without blackout restrictions. This physical evidence challenged the narratives Japanese officers had continually repeated, that America was on the verge of collapse, that its people suffered more than Japan's civilians, and that Japanese victory was inevitable. On July 17, 1945, the train arrived at Camp McCoy's rail siding at 1400 hours. Kenji had braced himself during the final miles, convinced that the relative mercy he'd received thus far was temporary, and that the true brutality would begin at the processing centers. 2 American MPS efficiently lifted him onto a stretcher and loaded him into an ambulance marked with red crosses, identical to those on the hospital ship. The vehicle drove through Camp McCoy's gates, past guard towers and barbed wire, but continued beyond the main prisoner compound toward a separate medical complex. The hospital, a 2-story wooden structure with screened windows, opened to Wisconsin's summer air. Orderlies transferred Kenji directly onto a wheeled gurney and pushed him through double doors into a receiving area that smelled of disinfectant and floor wax. White walls and humming electric lights greeted him. A stocky sergeant with medical insignia checked a clipboard, consulted a doctor, and then directed Kenji to a second-floor ward. The elevator ride upward was a shock. A hospital with an elevator, clean, functional, and operated by a man who casually nodded to medical staff as if transporting enemy wounded was routine. Kenji's field hospitals on Saipan and Okinawa had been makeshift caves and bunkers where surgeons operated by candlelight. Morphine ran out quickly, and gangrene claimed more lives than enemy fire. This American facility functioned like the modern Tokyo hospital he'd seen before the war, before strategic bombing reduced Japanese cities to ash. The ward contained 20 beds, 10 of which were occupied by Japanese prisoners in various stages of recovery. A nurse instructed orderlies to place Kenji in a bed near the windows. The mattress had springs, the sheets were laundered white cotton, and a metal nightstand held a water pitcher and glass. The other wounded Japanese prisoners watched his arrival with a mix of relief and continued bewilderment. A young American nurse, Lieutenant Morrison, approached Kenji's bed with a metal tray of medical supplies. Her crisp white uniform bore lieutenant's bars, and her brown hair was pinned beneath a nurse's cap. Kenji tensed, anticipating the revulsion Japanese propaganda had promised. He'd been told American women harbored a special hatred for Japanese soldiers, would revel in their suffering, and would only touch them with cruelty. She set down the tray and studied his medical chart, her face professionally neutral. "Sergeant Tanaka," she said, carefully pronouncing his name. "I'm Lieutenant Morrison. I need to examine your wound and change the dressing." Kenji, understanding English from pre-war studies, nodded, unable to speak. Lieutenant Morrison pulled back the sheet and began to expertly unwrap the bandages on his left leg. Despite earlier treatment, the wound had festered during transport and the gauze was yellow with infection. She showed no disgust. Her gloved hands methodically cleaned the surgical site with stinging antiseptic solution. Kenji searched her face for the anticipated hatred, but she frowned only at the infection's severity, not at him. "This needs debriding," she told a doctor who approached, "probably another round of sulfur drugs." The doctor gently examined the wound. "Agreed. We'll schedule him for surgery tomorrow morning." The shrapnel fragments weren't all removed initially. They discussed Kenji's treatment as if he were simply a patient, not a defeated enemy who had fought to kill Americans. Lieutenant Morrison applied fresh bandages, then checked his temperature and pulse, making efficient notations on his chart. "You'll need to keep the leg elevated," she told Kenji directly. "No weight on it for at least 2 weeks. Do you understand?" He managed a whispered yes in English. She adjusted the pillow under his leg, then moved to the next patient, a corporal with burns on his arms, extending the same professional attention and absence of cruelty. The cognitive dissonance created physical pressure in Kenji's chest. He had been prepared for death, torture, or medical neglect. Japanese officers had insisted the Geneva Conventions were mere propaganda, and America would never extend such protections to Japanese prisoners. Yet here, the undeniable evidence shattered those certainties, fragmenting his entire understanding of the enemy. At 1800 hours, a medical orderly delivered dinner, a metal tray holding beef stew with actual meat chunks, mashed potatoes with butter, green beans, white bread, and a square of chocolate cake. Kenji stared at the portions. On Okinawa, his rations had been reduced to handfuls of rice mixed with weeds. Japanese civilians were starving in firebombed cities. War-yet American POW camps served chocolate cake to enemy wounded. Across the ward, Corporal Yoshida, another prisoner, noticed Kenji's expression. "It's real," Yoshida said quietly in Japanese. "The food comes 3 times daily, always this much, sometimes more." "How long have you been here?" Kenji asked. 6 weeks, captured on Iwo Jima with stomach wounds. The American surgeon saved my life." Yoshida's voice carried the same bewildered tone. "They used blood plasma, antibiotics, everything necessary." A private in the next bed added, "I watched them operate on Lieutenant Sato last week. Brain surgery. They spent 11 hours keeping him alive. An enemy officer." The private shook his head. "This is not what we were taught." After sunset, as the ward lights dimmed, Kenji lay awake, processing the day's revelations. When night nurses checked on patients every 2 hours, medications arrived on schedule, no one threatened them, no one withheld treatment. This stark contrast with Japanese military philosophy, where wounded soldiers were expected to commit suicide rather than burden their units, where surrender meant eternal dishonor, created a psychological chasm Kenji couldn't bridge. He remembered the grenades his squad leader had given him. The expectation was clear: choose death over capture. Yet survival had led him here to clean sheets, professional medical care, beef stew, and chocolate cake to American nurses who exhibited no hatred despite the war's savagery. Everything he'd believed about American barbarism was collapsing under the weight of observable reality. Lieutenant Morrison returned during her night rounds to check his temperature again. Though the thermometer showed a slight fever from the infection, she made notes, then adjusted his IV drip without comment. Her competence was absolute, and her treatment identical to what she would give American casualties. Why? The question, haltingly in English, escaped Kenji before he could stop it. She paused, considering him. "Why what, Sergeant?" "Why not let us die? We are enemy." Lieutenant Morrison's expression shifted, not to anger, but to a profound sadness. "Because you're wounded," she said simply. "The war doesn't change that. Medical care is medical care." She moved to the next bed, leaving Kenji with that statement. "The war doesn't change that." It was a philosophy utterly alien to everything Japanese military doctrine had taught him about total war, about the necessity of absolute brutality, about enemies deserving no mercy. Through the window, Wisconsin's stars shone in patterns identical to those over Okinawa, but viewed from a different world. Kenji understood then that his survival had condemned him to something more psychologically devastating than death. He would live, heal, and eventually return to Japan carrying knowledge that would poison every certainty the empire had instilled. His nation had lied about America's weakness, its cruelty, and the inevitability of Japanese victory. If they had lied about this, what other foundational truths were false? Propaganda had prepared him for torture. Instead, he had discovered something far more destabilizing. An enemy who treated wounded prisoners with professional medical care, fed them beef and chocolate, operated elevators, and maintained electric lights while Japan's cities burned. Camp McCoy's hospital ward had become Kenji's first encounter with the magnitude of Japan's defeat, measured not in lost territory, but in the vast gulf between what he'd been promised about America and what actually existed. Tomorrow morning, American surgeons would operate on his leg again, using their seemingly endless supplies of antibiotics and plasma to save an enemy soldier's limb. They would do this not out of mercy or kindness, but from a medical philosophy that separated wounded humanity from warfare's hatreds. Kenji would have to reconcile that reality with every lie he'd been taught, every propaganda film he'd watched, and every certainty that had defined his service to the Emperor. The morphine drip pulled him towards sleep. But his mind kept circling back to Lieutenant Morrison's words, "Because you're wounded," as though that explained everything. As though the war didn't matter in this white-walled room where Japanese and American medical staff collaborated to prevent infection, manage pain, and preserve life regardless of nationality. He understood now that surviving his wounds on Okinawa had delivered him not to the anticipated brutality of enemy captivity, but to something far more dangerous. The truth about America's abundance, its capacity, its fundamental difference from the desperate, starving empire that had sent him to die for nothing. Camp McCoy's hospital would heal his shattered leg, but the psychological damage from this cognitive dissonance would take far longer to process. Everything he'd believed was breaking apart, bed by clean bed, meal by impossible meal, kind professional gesture by kind professional gesture. There would be no returning to the certainties that had defined his existence before an American nurse gently cleaned his wound while explaining that medical care remained medical care, even in total war. On September 3rd, 1945, 3 days after Japan's surrender, Sergeant Kenji Tanaka was discharged from the hospital, his shrapnel wounds still tender, but declared fit for light duty by the American physical therapist. The POW camp unfolded before him, an unbelievable sight. 200 Japanese prisoners moved through spaces that felt more like a quaint American town than a prison. At 900, the PX store opened. Kenji joined the line, holding the script issued as wages for camp work. Inside, shelves brimmed with Hershey bars, Lucky Strike cigarettes, Colgate toothpaste, Gillette razors, writing paper, pencils, and magazines. Private Nakamura purchased 3 Coca-Colas and a Life magazine without guards or supervision. The American clerk, a smiling, middle-aged volunteer from Toma, showed no hint of animosity towards men whose comrades had killed her nephew at Iwo Jima. Kenji bought cigarettes and soap, items that would have cost a month's salary in wartime Japan, with just 2 days of kitchen wages. Lunch was served at 1200. Kenji carried his tray past steam tables laden with fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, white bread, apple pie, and fresh milk. The portions were far more generous than anything he'd received in the Imperial Army. Corporal Yamada, a Saipan survivor, sat across from him, eating slowly, his eyes distant. He remarked on the authentic taste of the chicken, a stark contrast to the poor rations they had subsisted on even before the naval blockade. His family in Osaka, he mentioned, was surviving on acorns and tree bark, his sister boiling leather for broth. Kenji, unable to finish his meal, dumped half of it, the guilt outweighing the pleasure of the food. After lunch, work assignments began. Kenji reported to the camp laundry. American staff supervised Japanese POWs, washing hospital and barracks linens. The industrial washers, dryers, hot water, and electric irons fascinated him, especially the seemingly wasteful quantities of pressed sheets. Sergeant Morrison, the American laundry supervisor, patiently demonstrated the washer controls, speaking slow English and gesturing. Morrison, who had fought in the Philippines and seen orders of no surrender, now taught Kenji how to use detergent. He set temperatures and add bleach. During the afternoon break, Morrison shared his coffee and photos of his wife and daughters in Milwaukee. Kenji struggled to reconcile this gentle treatment with the enemy propaganda that depicted Americans as torturers and desecrators. The afternoon recreation period, from 1500 to 1700, found Kenji observing Japanese POWs playing baseball with equipment provided by the Red Cross, others at a volleyball net. Some read in the library, a barracks converted into a reading room stocked with Japanese books, American newspapers, and English primers. Lieutenant Suzuki, formerly of the Kwantung Army, taught an English class, explaining that learning English would be beneficial post-repatriation. Some POWs openly discussed remaining in America, even applying for immigration. This idea deeply shocked Kenji. We're abandoning Japan, forging new lives in the enemy nation, forgetting the emperor and homeland. Suzuki, noticing Kenji's expression, pulled him aside. Japan, he explained quietly, was destroyed. American bombers had razed 64 cities, and Hiroshima and Nagasaki had vanished under atomic weapons. The emperor himself had surrendered. What was left to return to? The Americans offered food, work, and dignity. Suzuki planned to request agricultural work in Wisconsin, learn farming, and apply for citizenship when permitted, a plan shared by 30 other POWs who openly discussed American customs and opportunities. Evening brought a profound sense of dissonance. At 1800, a bus arrived with volunteers from the local Methodist church in Sparta. 6 American women and 2 men unloaded boxes of donated clothing, books, and toiletries. Mrs. Patterson, whose son had died at Guadalcanal, organized the distribution with efficient kindness. She knew basic Japanese phrases and used a dictionary to communicate, asking POWs about their families and noting names for Red Cross inquiries. She treated these Japanese soldiers, men who had fought to kill Americans, with the same maternal concern she'd show her own son's friends. Kenji, accepting a warm coat, was speechless, unable to comprehend such forgiveness. Mrs. Patterson patted his shoulder and moved on. Kenji later learned Sparta had lost 14 boys in the Pacific, yet these townspeople visited weekly, bringing comfort to their son's enemies. The evening mail call delivered letters that shattered Kenji's understanding. His brother in Yokohama wrote that the city was rubble. American occupation forces were distributing food to prevent starvation. His brother worked for them, clearing debris for daily rations. Their mother had died in the March firebombing. Their father had survived but lost everything. The brother wrote cautiously, knowing censors read letters, mentioning American soldiers sharing chocolate with children and maintaining order without expected reprisals. He asked if Kenji was treated well, if stories about American camps were true. Kenji stared at the letter, comparing his brother's hunger to the apple pie he couldn't finish at lunch. The war Japan promised to win had forced his family to beg their conquerors for rice. The enemy Japan taught him to hate now fed him 3 meals a day, plus snacks. Corporal Yamada on the next bunk read his own letter, his voice breaking. His wife and children had survived, evacuated to the countryside, but lived in a one-room shack, sleeping on straw, eating American relief rations. His son asked when he would come home, if he had food, and if America was as terrible as the soldiers had claimed. Yamada's hands shook. He looked at Kenji, his certainty gone. Everything they taught us was lies, he said. The Americans were not supposed to be like this. We were told they would torture us, starve us, work us to death. Instead, they feed us better than our own army. They give us medicine, beds, wages, kindness. What does that make us? What does that make our war? The question hung heavy in the barracks as night deepened. Other POWs joined the careful conversation, testing their new understanding. Private Sato spoke of the American doctor who removed his appendix, who visited daily and brought him ice cream. Sergeant Ishida described the guard who taught him baseball, even bringing his own glove. Lieutenant Hamada recounted how the American chaplain arranged a Buddhist service, providing incense and a quiet space, respecting their faith while offering his own. Each story added weight, tipping the scales against the propaganda, against everything Tokyo had taught them about Western devils. At 2100, a movie was shown in the recreation hall, an American Western with subtitles. Japanese POWs crowded onto benches, watching cowboys, frontier justice, American mythology of honor and fair combat. Silence was followed by discussion. They debated whether Americans truly believed in the honor portrayed, if the Geneva Convention paralleled the fictional cowboys' code. Some argued American treatment of POWs proved the honor was real. Others insisted this kindness was temporary, but even skeptics couldn't point to evidence of cruelty or abuse beyond captivity itself. Kenji lay on his bunk that night, smoking an American cigarette bought with American wages, his stomach full of American food, his wounds healing under American medicine, surrounded by Japanese soldiers questioning all they believed. Barracks lights dimmed at 2200. In the darkness, men whispered of the future. Repatriation ships would eventually return them to a Japan occupied by the very enemy who now fed them. Some POWs considered volunteering for labor details to extend their stay in America, delaying return to devastation. Others spoke of transferring to agricultural camps to learn skills for rebuilding. A few, like Lieutenant Suzuki, plotted to remain permanently, disappearing into American society. Kenji's mind circled the same thoughts. Bushido demanded death over surrender. He had surrendered, expecting execution or torture, but received surgery, rehabilitation, and kindness. Propaganda promised American barbarism, yet he found American generosity, even from those who had lost sons and brothers to Japanese bullets. His education, training, his entire worldview rested on a foundation the Americans had systematically demolished simply by treating him according to their laws and customs. The cognitive dissonance created pressure behind his eyes, a weight in his chest. He had believed himself an emperor's warrior, serving a divine cause against subhuman enemies. Now he worked in their laundry, ate their surplus food, accepted their charity. He was struggling to identify which part of him remained Japanese and which was transforming. September bled into October. Rumors of repatriation schedules spread, of who would board the first ships, of conditions in occupied Japan. The Americans maintained their routines, managing the camp with casual efficiency and puzzling decency. Kenji's wounds healed completely. His English improved. His understanding of Americans deepened as his certainty about himself eroded. He wrote to his brother describing the camp, asking if American occupation troops truly behaved as their captors did here, if this kindness extended from Wisconsin prison camps to Tokyo streets, then everything changed. The enemy became something else entirely. The war became different than he was told. Sergeant Kenji Tanaka, prisoner of war, veteran of a lost cause, she stood on crumbling ground, awaiting repatriation to a homeland he no longer recognized, from a captivity that had shattered every certainty about friend, enemy, honor, and shame. On August 15, 1945, at 2:47 p.m., Camp McCoy's loudspeakers broadcast Emperor Hirohito's surrender, a tinny, distant voice signifying the war's end. Sergeant Kenji Tanaka stood with 374 other Japanese prisoners listening to the unprecedented address. The Gyokuon Hoso, or dual voice broadcast, concluded the conflict. Around Tanaka, men wept, collapsed, or stood in shock. Contrary to propaganda predicting execution, America gathered prisoners that evening. The commandant, through interpreters, announced repatriation procedures would begin within weeks, with no punishment or executions planned. This starkly highlighted the disconnect between propaganda and reality. In subsequent days, American staff increased rations, freely distributed Red Cross packages, and conducted medical examinations to ensure prisoners were fit for their journey home. For soldiers indoctrinated to view capture as dishonorable, the prospect of returning alive caused profound psychological turmoil. Some prisoners, fearing ostracism, requested to stay in America, but American policy mandated the repatriation of all Japanese military prisoners. Processing began in September 1945. At Camp McCoy, Tanaka underwent final health screenings. Having arrived in 1944 at 98 pounds, suffering battlefield wounds and malnutrition from his capture in the Marshall Islands, he now weighed 146 pounds. His medical file showed a complete recovery from shrapnel wounds to his left leg and shoulder, thanks to 3 surgeries, penicillin, physical rehabilitation, and dental work. The examining physician deemed him fit for travel. On October 3, 1945, Tanaka and 212 other Japanese POWs boarded trains at Camp McCoy, headed for Camp Stoneman, California, the primary Pacific repatriation center. The 4-day train journey across America offered Tanaka a view of vast farmlands, intact cities, and bustling industrial centers. The sheer scale of American industrial capacity made Japan's wartime claims of imminent victory seem absurd. At Camp Stoneman, final processing took 3 weeks. American authorities required prisoners to surrender all U.S. military-issued items except basic clothing. Tanaka kept only the boots that replaced his worn Imperial Army footwear, documentation of his treatment, and letters from American medical staff explaining his surgeries, items he hoped would protect him from accusations of collaboration. On October 28, 1945, Tanaka boarded the USS Lurline, a converted passenger liner transporting 1,400 Japanese POWs from various American camps. The ship departed San Francisco on October 30th. The 18-day Pacific crossing was slow to conserve fuel. Onboard conditions reflected American pragmatism, not vengeance. Prisoners received 3 daily meals, medical care, and designated deck access. Japanese officers, separated from enlisted men per Geneva Convention protocols, occupied different holds. Tanaka spent hours on deck, watching the Pacific, filled with dread. Other prisoners shared his anxiety. Conversations revolved around what awaited them. Had families survived the firebombing? Would they face war crimes prosecutions? Would communities accept them or brand them cowards? The propaganda about American savagery proved false. Now they faced uncertainty about their own nation's reaction to defeat. The Lurline reached Uraga Harbor near Yokohama on November 17, 1945. Tanaka was stunned by Japan's devastation. Harbor facilities were damaged, industrial areas reduced to rubble. As the ship docked, prisoners lined the rails, gazing at their ruined homeland. American personnel supervised disembarkation strictly. Japanese authorities, under Allied occupation, processed returning POWs through tent facilities. Officers from General Douglas MacArthur's Supreme Commander for the Allied powers screened for war criminals. Most enlisted men, like Tanaka, passed quickly. The Japanese officials documenting his return showed cold efficiency, offering no welcome or acknowledgement of his service or survival. He received temporary identification, ration cards, and instructions to report to his home prefecture's demobilization office within 30 days. No medical follow-up or inquiry about his treatment was offered. He was processed like cargo. Tanaka traveled by damaged railway to Tokyo, a journey that once took hours, now 2 days due to destroyed infrastructure. Tokyo's devastation surpassed his imagination. The March 1945 firebombing had incinerated 16 square miles. Entire neighborhoods vanished, replaced by shanties of rubble. The acrid smell of burned wood persisted. At the Shibuya demobilization office, housed in a surviving government building, Tanaka completed his discharge. The official reviewing his file noticed the American medical documentation, his expression hardening. He asked no questions, but stamped the papers silently, a judgment conveyed. Becoming a prisoner, regardless of circumstance, marked a man. Tanaka found his family in Saitama Prefecture, north of Tokyo. His parents survived, their home replaced by a shack. His younger brother died in Okinawa. His sister worked in an occupation-managed textile factory. The reunion was subdued, overshadowed by grief for his brother rather than joy for his return. When he tried to describe his American captivity, his father's face tightened, his mother looked away. The subject changed. The shame of capture, deeply ingrained in imperial military culture, created an unbreachable wall. In 1947, Tanaka found work as a clerk in a trading company reorganized under occupation authorities. The pay was poor, rations scarce, but employment was hard to find in shattered Tokyo. His English, improved through informal classes American guards allowed for prisoners, gave him an advantage. He translated shipping documents and corresponded with American import firms. His supervisors never inquired about his English. In post-occupation Japanese society, discussing wartime experiences was complex. Some former prisoners faced collaboration accusations or suspicion of revealing secrets. Tanaka learned silence. He married in 1950. During their engagement, he told his wife about his capture and imprisonment. She listened expressionlessly, then asked him never to discuss it publicly. This agreement to bury his past enabled their marriage. They had 3 children between 1951 and 1957. Tanaka worked steadily, advancing to senior clerk, his English skills vital as Japan's economy rebuilt. He provided for his family, bought a small house in 1963, and sent his children to university. By external measures, he succeeded. Internally, the cognitive dissonance remained. Throughout his life, Tanaka kept his Camp McCoy documentation, surgical notes, nurses' letters, Red Cross photos, in a locked box, reviewing them alone. In the 1970s, his eldest son asked about his wartime service. Tanaka showed him the documents. His son, educated in post-war schools emphasizing Japan's victimization, struggled to reconcile his father's account with persistent narratives of American brutality. The conversation strained their relationship, and Tanaka again chose silence. He never attended veterans' gatherings, where former Imperial Army soldiers often excluded or marginalized those who surrendered. He avoided media debates on POW treatment. He lived quietly, a ghost with knowledge contradicting accepted narratives, unable to share it. When he died in 1991 at 73, his obituary listed him merely as a former soldier. His widow burned most papers, but his children kept the Camp McCoy documentation, rarely discussing it. Tanaka's story exemplifies the broader experiences of Japanese POWs in American captivity. Of approximately 5,600 Japanese military personnel captured by U.S. forces during the Pacific War, most were held in camps across America, including Wisconsin, Texas, Colorado, and California. Their treatment sharply contrasted with Japanese military doctrine. Or the 1941 Senjinkun military code forbade capture, ordering soldiers to fight to the death or commit suicide. So ingrained was this doctrine that many captured Japanese soldiers, often wounded and unconscious, attempted suicide upon regaining consciousness. At Camp McCoy and similar facilities, American medical staff prevented these attempts, providing psychiatric alongside physical care, though few prisoners cooperated with psychological counseling, viewing it as interrogation. American treatment of Japanese POWs adhered to Geneva Convention protocols, despite Japan not having ratified the 1929 convention, though it agreed to follow provisions in 1942. Medical care, food, living conditions, and labor assignments met international standards. Wounded prisoners received the same medical treatment as American wounded. including sulfur drugs and penicillin. The survival rate of Japanese POWs in American custody exceeded 98%, while Allied POWs in Japanese custody faced death rates of 27 to 37%. This stark disparity profoundly affected Japanese prisoners who, upon repatriation, confronted societies told Americans tortured and executed captives. Many returning POWs, like Tanaka, faced disbelief, suspicion of collaboration, and social ostracism that silenced their accounts for decades. The legacy of Japanese POW experiences in American camps has influenced modern understanding of POW treatment and cultural factors in military conflict. First, documented cases from Camp McCoy became foundational case studies in post-war analyses of propaganda's effect on soldiers. Research by U.S. military psychologists in the late 1940s, based on interviews with repatriated Japanese POWs, revealed how imperial military indoctrination fostered expectations of execution upon capture, completely contradicted by American treatment. This research informed the development of psychological operations and enemy POW handling protocols for future conflicts. Second, medical documentation from facilities like Camp McCoy's hospital provided concrete evidence of Geneva Convention implementation, valuable during debates for the 1949 revisions. The contrast between American and Japanese treatment of POWs strengthened arguments for more stringent enforcement, though implementation remained problematic. Third, the long silence of Japanese POWs about their American captivity highlighted how national shame narratives can suppress historical truth for generations. Not until the 1980s and 1990s did substantial numbers of former Japanese POWs begin speaking publicly. Historians like Ulrich Strauss, who documented Japanese POW experiences at Camp McCoy, and Japanese oral history researchers finally created space for these stories. Museums at former campsites now include exhibits on Japanese POW experiences, though Japanese survivor participation remains limited. The 1995 Smithsonian Enola Gay exhibition controversy, sparking debates on Pacific War narratives, indirectly opened discussion for more nuanced POW experiences on both sides. Fourth, the humanity shown by American medical personnel towards enemy prisoners who expected execution became a teaching point in modern military medical ethics and detainee operations training. The U.S. Army Medical Department uses historical records from Camp McCoy and similar facilities in professional military education to illustrate proper POW medical care under combat conditions. The Camp McCoy documentation is preserved in the Wisconsin Historical Society and National Archives. Researchers have identified individual cases like Tanaka's by cross-referencing American and Japanese records. While Tanaka's story is a composite based on documented patterns, his medical treatment was standard across American POW camps for Japanese prisoners. Surgical logs from Camp McCoy's hospital show hundreds of procedures between 1944 and 1946, from emergency battlefield wound treatment to dental work and malnutrition treatment. Survival rates and recovery matched or exceeded American soldiers, documented in medical after-action reports. The cognitive dissonance experienced by prisoners confronting this reality is a unique chapter in understanding how war propaganda affects survivors when its falsehood is revealed, and how that knowledge, suppressed by shame, can haunt individuals for lifetimes while slowly reshaping historical understanding across generations.